She always remembered her father as a quiet man with kind eyes and a steady presence, the kind of man who never raised his voice but made himself heard through calm certainty. Their life together was not glamorous, but it was filled with small, meaningful rituals: early morning breakfasts with scrambled eggs and toast, Sunday walks to the park, and quiet evenings watching old black and white movies. Her childhood was wrapped in a sense of gentle security, built brick by the kind of love that didn't shout, but stayed. After her mother passed away when she was just a child, her father became everything: her comfort, her protector, her world. He never spoke much about his grief, but she knew he carried it like a hidden weight in his chest, something he never let crush them both. For years it was just the two of them, and in that small bubble, she grew up believing nothing could ever change the bond they had. When he eventually remarried, she was 17. Old enough to understand that he deserved happiness, but young enough to feel like someone was stepping into a space that wasn't theirs to occupy. Her stepmother was elegant, polished, always composed. She smiled at the right times, offered compliments that sounded perfectly rehearsed, and took over the house with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. At first, the girl tried to welcome her. She wanted to believe this new chapter would be just another version of family, different but not worse. But there was always a thin layer of coldness beneath her stepmother's charm, something that never fully thawed no matter how much time passed. Her father didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he chose not to. He was softer around his new wife, a little more distracted, a little more tired. He still hugged his daughter each night, still asked about her day, but their quiet routines began to shift. The Sunday walks became less frequent. The movie nights were replaced by dinner parties with people she didn't know. And slowly, the house that once felt like hers began to feel curated, decorated in shades and silences that didn't belong to her. Yet she never stopped loving him. She forgave him for the distance because she knew he was trying to balance too many things: grief, love, change. She tried to adapt, to smile at her stepmother's suggestions, to accept the way everything began to look a little less like home. On the surface, everything seemed fine. To outsiders, they were a refined, blended family. People admired how well they had adjusted, how gracefully the pieces had come together. But behind the polite nods and holiday cards, there were shadows. Her stepmother had a way of being kind without being warm, of asking questions that sounded more like evaluations than interest. The girl learned to watch her words, to shrink herself just enough to avoid confrontation, to carry her memories of the past quietly so they wouldn't be trampled under the weight of her stepmother's presence. And her father, though never unkind, seemed to drift further into silence. His laughter was rarer, his eyes a little heavier, his touch a little more absent. Still, she told herself this was just adulthood. Families evolve. People change. She focused on school, built her own routines, carved out corners of life that still felt hers. And when her father got sick, she was the one who stayed by his side. Through the appointments, the long nights in hospital rooms, the whispered reassurances that everything would be okay, even when it wasn't, she never left him. Her stepmother was there, of course, dressed impeccably, asking all the right questions, performing the role of a grieving wife even before the final goodbye. But it was the daughter who saw him cry in the dark, who held his hand when the pain was too much, who whispered stories from their past into his ear when he was too weak to speak. She never asked for anything in return. Not credit. Not recognition. Just the knowledge that she was doing right by the man who had done everything for her. The days leading up to the funeral were a blur of numbness and autopilot. She didn't cry much. Grief sat in her like a stone, heavy and unmoving. She focused on the details, the logistics, the endless decisions that come with death. Her stepmother, ever composed, took charge of the guest list, the flowers, the speech. She didn't object. There was too much noise in her own mind to argue about centerpieces. But something about the way her stepmother moved during those days felt off. Too efficient. Too rehearsed. She smiled too easily, her voice too clear when speaking to people offering condolences. It wasn't grief. It was performance. The daughter noticed, but she said nothing. There was no room for confrontation at her father's funeral. Or so she thought. In the weeks after the funeral was planned but before it happened, the house felt colder than it ever had before. It wasn't the weather. It was the kind of chill that comes when something unseen passes through a room, when glances are too long or too short, and when silence becomes the loudest sound in the house. The stepmother moved through the rooms with quiet authority, touching everything, rearranging objects that had stood untouched for years, deciding what would stay and what would go, as though the life they all once shared could be packed into neat boxes and labeled for storage. She never consulted the daughter about any of it. Books disappeared from shelves. Photos were moved or replaced. Her father's favorite chair vanished one day with no explanation. When asked, the stepmother simply said it was old and needed to be thrown out. There were errands to run, decisions to make, guests to be notified. Yet despite the flurry of funeral preparations, there was a growing sense that something else was happening beneath the surface, something deeper than grief. The stepmother spoke often of legacy, of how her husband would want to be remembered, of the proper way to honor his life. She held meetings in the living room with distant relatives, neighbors, and church members, speaking in calm, measured tones about programs and flowers, about speakers and seating arrangements. She seemed to thrive in the planning, as though the sorrow gave her a stage upon which she could perform composure, elegance, and control. The daughter, meanwhile, drifted through it all like a ghost, present but unseen, her thoughts consumed not just with loss but with unease. There were small signs, strange omissions that began to add up. Her name was left out of the obituary draft that the stepmother submitted to the newspaper. When the daughter saw it, she said nothing, assuming it was a mistake, but the correction was never made. At first, she thought it was grief clouding her stepmother's judgment. But as the days passed, it felt more intentional. During conversations about the funeral service, the stepmother referred to her as the girl when talking to others, rarely using her name. As if trying to create distance or remove her altogether from the narrative being constructed around the man they had both loved. Whenever she tried to bring up something personal about her father, his favorite music, the poem he once said he wanted read at his funeral, the stepmother would either dismiss it or offer a gentle but firm alternative. He probably changed his mind, she would say with a faint smile, as if she alone had access to his last wishes. It wasn't just the decisions or the erasures. It was the way people began to look at her, subtly, curiously, as though they knew something she didn't. At first, she thought it was just the awkwardness of grief, the way people avoid direct eye contact when they don't know what to say. But there was something different in their glances and uncertainty, a hesitance that felt less like sympathy and more like judgment. Whispers seemed to trail behind her, and once, when she entered a room, a conversation stopped too quickly. She could feel the air shift when she passed certain relatives, especially those from her stepmother's side, as if they were assessing her, weighing her place in a family that now felt less and less like her own. Her father's illness had progressed quickly, too quickly. One month he was walking through the garden, laughing about planting tomatoes next spring, and the next he was bedbound, his once steady hands trembling with weakness. The doctors had said it was aggressive, terminal. There had been little time for goodbyes, and even less for understanding. She had spent his final weeks by his side, but now she wondered if, during that time, conversations had been had behind closed doors, about the will, about family, about her. The stepmother had been oddly quiet about any legal matters, brushing off any questions with vague reassurances. "Everything is being handled," she would say, her voice smooth and distant. One evening, she had found an old envelope in her father's drawer. It had her name on it. Inside was a photograph of the two of them when she was a child, taken on a fishing trip they had gone on alone. On the back, in his neat handwriting, were the words, "My girl, always." She clutched the photo tightly, feeling a swell of grief rise in her chest. But beneath the grief was something else. A gnawing sense that something was being taken from her piece by piece, not just her father but her identity, her belonging, her place in the story of his life. The stepmother's behavior grew more curious as the funeral approached. She began locking certain rooms, moving papers from one drawer to another, guarding her phone like a secret. There were late-night phone calls she took in hushed tones, and more than once, the daughter heard her mention the word property, followed by silences and then laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter that comes from fond remembrance. It was colder, calculated. She tried to dismiss her suspicions, telling herself that grief made people act strangely, that maybe the stepmother was just trying to protect herself from the chaos of loss. But the truth was beginning to form like a shadow in her mind. Unshaped, unconfirmed, but present. She began to go over old conversations in her head, things her stepmother had said over the years that had seemed offhand at the time but now rang with new meaning. Once, during an argument when she was 16, her stepmother had shouted, "You're lucky to even be here." At the time, she had assumed it was just a cruel remark born of frustration. But now it replayed in her memory like an echo, sharp and pointed. Had she always meant more than that? The day before the funeral, she overheard a conversation between her stepmother and a man she didn't recognize, perhaps a family lawyer. She had been walking past the study when she heard her name spoken, followed by phrases like, "not legally relevant," and "no official record." She froze outside the door, breath held, but the voices dropped too low for her to catch anything else. When she entered the room minutes later, her stepmother was alone. The call ended. She looked up, offered a brief smile, and returned to sorting through papers without a word. That night, sleep didn't come easily. She lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, heart heavy and mind racing. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and it was buried under layers of civility and politeness and the rituals of mourning. She thought about her father, about how much he had loved her, how often he told her that she was his everything. And yet, doubt was now creeping in, not because of anything he had done, but because of everything being orchestrated in his absence. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it. But the silence, the glances, the omissions, they all pointed to a truth too devastating to name. The funeral was set for noon the next day. She would stand there, in front of all the people who had known her father, who had known her, and try to hold herself together. But something told her that tomorrow would not go the way funerals usually did. There was a storm gathering behind her stepmother's eyes, and whatever it was coming for her. The morning of the funeral arrived with a strange kind of stillness, the air heavy and unmoving, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation. She rose early, long before the others, her body moving on instinct while her mind floated somewhere distant. Her black dress hung from her shoulders like armor, its weight unfamiliar but necessary. Outside, the sun filtered through gray clouds, casting everything in a pale, washed-out light. It was not raining, but the sky looked like it might weep at any moment. The house was filled with the low murmur of preparation, doors opening and closing, the clinking of dishes, quiet conversations spoken in respectful tones. A few distant relatives had spent the night, and their voices blended into the background like distant echoes. The daughter moved through it all like a ghost, offering quiet nods and faint smiles, her presence acknowledged but not truly seen. The stepmother, immaculate in a tailored black dress and pearls that shimmered against her pale skin, was at the center of it all. She moved with the calm precision of someone hosting a formal event rather than burying a husband. Every detail had been accounted for, from the floral arrangements to the carefully folded programs placed at the entrance of the chapel. When they arrived at the funeral home, the room was already half filled with people dressed in shades of mourning, their faces solemn and reflective. The casket rested at the front beneath a cascade of white lilies and roses, the polished wood gleaming under the soft lighting. A framed photograph of her father sat beside it, a picture she didn't remember choosing. He looked younger in it, distant, almost unfamiliar. She wanted to look away but couldn't. Her chest tightened as she took her seat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, nails pressing into skin. As the service began, the officiant spoke with practiced empathy, recounting her father's accomplishments, his devotion to his community, his kindness, his role as a loving husband and stepfather. The words floated above her, detached from the man she had known so intimately. The people around her nodded, dabbed at their eyes, some even smiled softly at the memories shared. She felt out of place, as though she were watching a play about a stranger who only resembled her father. Then the stepmother stood. She walked slowly to the front, heels tapping rhythmically against the floor. The sound sharpened the hush that settled over the room. She paused beside the casket, one hand resting lightly on the polished surface, the other clutching a folded piece of paper. She looked out at the gathered crowd, her expression calm and composed, almost regal. There was a moment of silence before she began to speak, her voice smooth and measured, carefully modulated for the acoustics of the room. She spoke about grief, about love, about the ache of losing a partner. She thanked everyone for coming, acknowledged those who had traveled far, offered warm words to friends and colleagues. She recounted stories of their life together, shared anecdotes that painted their marriage in golden light. But the daughter noticed the omissions. There were no mentions of childhood birthdays, of shared vacations before the stepmother entered the picture, of the years it had been just father and daughter. The narrative being crafted was one where the past began when the stepmother arrived. Then the tone shifted. The stepmother folded her paper, tucked it into her purse, and looked around the room again with eyes that held something sharper now, something calculated. Her voice dropped slightly, just enough to draw the room closer. She said there was something important she needed to share, something that had weighed on her for a long time. She paused, letting the silence stretch. The daughter felt her body stiffen, her breath caught somewhere between lungs and throat. With quiet gravity, the stepmother explained that she had made a difficult discovery not long before her husband's passing. She said it with a sorrowful expression, the kind reserved for unfortunate truths that could no longer be ignored. Then, with a voice that did not shake, she announced that the young woman sitting in the front row was not, in fact, her husband's biological daughter. The room fell into stunned silence. A few audible gasps echoed, followed by an uneasy shifting of bodies and whispered questions. The daughter sat frozen, unable to move, unable to process what she had just heard. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the rest of the stepmother's speech. The woman continued speaking, explaining that the truth had come out through private means, that it had been her husband's wish to address it quietly, but that, sadly, he had passed before that could happen. She claimed it was not her intention to cause pain, but rather to speak truth, to honor her husband's legacy with honesty. The daughter felt as if the floor had been pulled out from beneath her. Faces turned toward her, some curious, some sympathetic, others merely stunned. The weight of 100 eyes bore down on her, and she could feel the blood drain from her face. Her mind raced, grasping for logic, for explanation. There had never been a doubt, not in her heart, not in her memories. Her father had loved her, raised her, called her his daughter every single day of her life. He had never made her feel like anything less. And now, in front of friends, family, and strangers, her identity was being torn away, reduced to a statement made by someone who had always kept her at arm's length. The officiant, unsure of how to proceed, stepped forward and gently thanked the stepmother for her words before returning to the script. But the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The funeral was no longer a space for mourning. It had become something else entirely. People whispered behind their hands, exchanged looks, avoided eye contact with the girl who had, just moments before, been the grieving daughter and now stood as the subject of scandal. The stepmother returned to her seat with the same composed expression she had worn all morning, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. But the daughter felt the rupture deep within her. Everything she had been holding together with quiet strength began to crack. She could feel the disbelief giving way to something hotter, sharper. Not just humiliation but fury. Not just betrayal but resolve. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She sat motionless through the remainder of the service, her face calm but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her heart pounded with the rhythm of something awakening, something ancient and fierce. She knew in that moment that whatever her stepmother's plan had been, it was not going to unfold the way she expected, because the daughter had something her stepmother didn't know about, something she had prepared for, something she had brought with her. As the final prayers were spoken and the guests began to rise, she remained seated for a long moment, her gaze fixed ahead, her mind already moving through the next steps. The truth wasn't fragile. It didn't need to be whispered behind closed doors. It could stand on its own, even in the harshest light. Especially there. And if her stepmother wanted to speak of bloodlines and proof, then she would give her exactly that. The room emptied slowly, the hum of conversation low and uneasy, as guests filed past the casket offering their last respects. No one seemed to know what to say to her. Some looked away entirely, pretending not to see her seated motionless in the front row, while others approached with awkward smiles and half-hearted condolences that dissolved into silence. The moment that should have honored her father had instead become a spectacle. Eyes no longer regarded her with sympathy, but with curiosity, as if she were a question left hanging in the air, an unsolved riddle cast out during mourning. She waited. She sat still while the last of the crowd whispered their goodbyes and drifted out through the heavy doors, their murmurs fading behind them. Her stepmother lingered near the entrance, deep in conversation with a woman dressed in gray, gesturing lightly with one hand, nodding, offering that same polished smile that seemed carved into her face. Not once did she look back. Not once did she acknowledge the girl sitting alone in the front row, the one she had just stripped of identity in front of an entire room. It was as though she had already erased her completely. But the daughter didn't move, not yet. Her heart was beating slow and steady now, the way it did when the mind stops spinning and something clearer takes hold. The shock had faded, replaced by something grounded and still. She wasn't going to let it end like this. She hadn't come to this funeral unprepared. Weeks ago, in the quiet uncertainty that followed her father's final days, she had begun to feel the edges of something wrong. It wasn't a single moment, but a pattern, a chain of small, unsettling incidents that hinted at a deeper deception. So she had followed that instinct, quietly, privately, without telling anyone what she was doing. She had visited the doctor who had overseen her father's care and requested access to certain records. She had called an attorney friend from college and asked questions she never thought she'd need to ask. And finally, she had ordered a DNA test. It hadn't been easy. It had required careful planning, emotional control, and a strength she didn't know she possessed. She had taken an old hairbrush that belonged to her father, one he used daily until the very end. It still held traces of him, strands of hair, a part of his physical being untouched by manipulation or lies. She had sent it to a private lab, along with her own sample, and waited. The results had come 2 days before the funeral. She hadn't even opened them at first. The envelope had sat untouched on her desk as she stared at it with a mixture of dread and anticipation. When she finally broke the seal and read the words printed in black and white, she felt a rush of vindication, grief, and something close to rage. The test confirmed what she had always known deep in her bones. He was her father. Biologically, legally, emotionally, every way that mattered. The woman who claimed otherwise had lied, deliberately and cruelly, and now she had done so in front of everyone. She stood slowly, smoothed the fabric of her dress, and turned toward the podium. Her stepmother noticed the movement, pausing her conversation just long enough to glance in her direction. There was something unreadable in her expression, a flicker of something close to annoyance. But the daughter didn't hesitate. She walked up the center aisle with quiet, determined steps, her spine straight, her eyes forward. The room had mostly cleared, but enough people remained, lingering relatives, ushers, a few friends unsure whether to stay or leave. Their eyes turned toward her again, curiosity sharpening into alertness. She stepped up to the microphone, her fingers resting on the cool metal stand. She didn't speak right away. She looked out over the room at the empty chairs, at the faces of those who had witnessed her humiliation only minutes earlier. She took a deep breath, not to calm her nerves, but to summon the fire that had been building inside her for weeks. Then she reached into her handbag and withdrew the envelope. It was a simple, white document holder, thick and neatly sealed. She held it up, letting it be seen by everyone still in the room. Her voice was even as she spoke, clear and unshaken. There were no tears, no tremors, only quiet authority. She explained what the envelope contained. A DNA test. A confirmation of paternity. She told them how she had grown up in that house, how her father had loved her with a steadiness that asked for nothing in return, how he had been the one to raise her, guide her, shape her into who she was. And now, because of whispered lies and veiled motives, that bond had been dragged through the dirt on the day they were meant to celebrate his life. She didn't accuse. She didn't name her stepmother directly. She didn't need to. The truth carried its own gravity. She opened the envelope slowly, carefully, and removed the printed report. She read aloud the part that mattered most, the part that stated in bold type that the probability of paternity was 99.99%. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, no space for doubt. The room was silent. No one moved. Even those who had started to leave had turned back now, standing quietly at the edges of the chapel, drawn by the tension thick in the air. She lowered the paper, folding it once, and placed it on the podium for anyone to read. Her eyes found her stepmother across the room. Their gazes locked for a long moment. The woman's face had lost its poise. The mask had cracked just slightly, revealing something raw and unsettled beneath. But the daughter said nothing more. She didn't demand apology. She didn't seek pity. She let the truth hang in the room like the final note of a song, complete and irrefutable. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle, each step lighter than the one before. Something inside her had shifted. Not because she had won anything, but because she had taken back what was already hers. Her name, her place, her truth. In the days that followed, the story would spread. People would talk. Some would apologize, others would stay silent. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that her father had loved her with his whole heart, and that love was real, unshaken by lies. She had proven it not just to others but to herself. And in doing so, she had reclaimed not only her identity but her voice. The moment she walked away from the podium, something in the atmosphere of the room broke apart. It wasn't loud or sudden, but like a slow unraveling, an invisible thread snapping quietly, sending ripples outward that no one could ignore. The silence that followed her speech was no longer the quiet of mourning, but the silence of revelation. The kind that comes when something once hidden finally rises to the surface, undeniable and impossible to contain. People no longer looked at her with uncertainty or discomfort. Now their gazes followed her with sharp attention, and in some, a spark of realization. Those who had sat through the service assuming one version of truth were now confronted with another, clearer one, cold, clinical, and absolute. She returned to her seat with calmness etched into her every movement. There was no triumph on her face, no bitterness, just a quiet kind of peace, the stillness of someone who had nothing left to fear. The test results lay on the podium behind her like a weapon left in plain view, its contents echoing louder than any spoken word. Her stepmother still stood frozen near the chapel doors, a glass of water in hand, untouched. For a brief second she didn't move, as if processing what had just unfolded. Then came the first stirrings, the hushed voices of people whispering among themselves, uncertain, murmuring things that couldn't quite be heard but whose tone was unmistakable. Confusion, disbelief, curiosity, and in some cases anger. The stepmother's expression was unreadable. Her features, normally so carefully composed, were tight now, her jaw clenched, her eyes darting across the room. She looked for someone to meet her gaze, someone to offer silent support, but no one stepped forward. Even those who had stood close to her during the funeral began to inch away, their smiles faltering. The room seemed to shift on its axis. The power she had carried into that building, the control, the grace, the air of someone who dictated the terms, was dissolving like fog in sunlight. In its place was something smaller, more brittle. She clutched her purse tighter, as though trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Then came the questions. First softly, then louder. A cousin approached the podium to glance at the paper, scanning its contents, eyes wide. A neighbor leaned over to another, gesturing subtly in the daughter's direction. Murmurs turned to voices, voices turned to questions. Why would someone lie about something like that? What could she possibly gain by announcing that at the funeral? Had the father known? And most painfully, what kind of person does that to a grieving daughter? The daughter didn't need to answer. She simply sat still, eyes forward, letting the room speak for itself. The voices filled the space now, building in layers, louder and more certain, like a storm gathering energy. Her stepmother, realizing the shift, stepped forward as if to say something. She opened her mouth, tried to gather her words, but the moment was already gone. Her timing had failed. Her narrative had collapsed. And no explanation could undo the damage now. Someone asked to see the results again. Someone else demanded to know why she had lied. Another stood up and walked out, shaking their head in disbelief. What had once been her audience, her circle of validation, was turning. And as the weight of their judgment fell upon her, she could do nothing but stand there, eyes wide and hands trembling, as the carefully constructed version of events she had tried to present fell apart before everyone's eyes. It wasn't just the humiliation of being exposed. It was the realization that her power had never been real, that the control she thought she wielded was always conditional, always dependent on the silence and compliance of others. Now that silence was broken, and in its place was a chorus of truth, growing louder by the second. The daughter had not needed to raise her voice, to cry or scream or plead. All she had done was present the truth, and the truth had done the rest. Her stepmother tried once more to compose herself, lifting her chin slightly, her lips parting as if to explain. But the room no longer belonged to her. No one was listening. Even the officiant, once deferential and polite, stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. A few people began to leave, not in silence, but in protest. The flowers at the front of the chapel seemed garish now, the photo of her father beside the casket no longer a shared tribute, but a reminder of who had been wronged. The daughter watched all of this not with satisfaction, but with the quiet heaviness of someone who had simply done what was necessary. This wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. She hadn't wanted a scene. She hadn't wanted confrontation. But once the lie had been spoken aloud, she had no choice. Her father had raised her with truth, with integrity. And in defending that truth, she had honored him far more than any speech or flower arrangement ever could. The crowd began to thin, but the echo of what had happened lingered. People would remember this day not as a simple funeral, but as the moment when deception was dragged into the light. Some would call it scandal. Others would call it justice. For her, it was simply the final thread in a story that had needed to end. She had spent years trying to navigate a space where she was never fully welcomed, tiptoeing around the fragile ego of a woman who never truly accepted her. But now that space was gone. The mask had been removed. The truth had been spoken. And nothing could return to the way it was before. The funeral director approached gently, asking if she would like a few more minutes alone with her father. She nodded, rising to her feet, the strength in her limbs steady and certain. As the last of the guests trickled out, she walked slowly to the casket, placing a hand on its smooth surface. Her heart ached with grief, but it ached cleanly now, no longer tangled with confusion or doubt. She whispered a silent goodbye, not because she believed he was gone, but because it was time to release him from this moment. The pain of losing him would remain, but so would the love, and that love had just been proven in front of everyone. Behind her, the room was nearly empty. Her stepmother had left at some point, unnoticed. Slipped away into whatever silence remained, her presence no longer required. The lies she had tried to plant had withered under the light of the daughter's resolve. And though the day had begun in sorrow, it was ending in clarity. As she stepped out into the open air, the sky had finally cleared. The gray clouds were parting, allowing sunlight to pour through in slow, golden waves. She closed her eyes for a moment and let it wash over her. There would be more pain ahead, more unraveling, but for now there was peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace that comes from knowing who you are and standing firmly in it, no matter who tries to tear it away. The days that followed the funeral were slow and strangely quiet, as if the world itself had paused in a long breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The daughter returned to her father's house, the one she had grown up in, now stripped of its familiar warmth. The wall still held his memory, but the air felt different, emptier and colder, like something vital had been drained from the space. Each room carried a trace of him, his books stacked beside the reading chair that no longer stood in the corner, his cologne stained on a coat still hanging by the door, his handwriting scribbled in the margins of half-read newspapers. She moved through the house with reverence, touching things gently as though disturbing them might break something sacred. Her stepmother had not returned since the funeral. After leaving the service abruptly, she had vanished without explanation. There were rumors that she had gone to stay with distant relatives in another state, whispers that a confrontation with extended family had pushed her away. But the daughter didn't seek her out. She didn't need to. The damage had been done, the mask removed, the truth made permanent. And in the silence that followed, something surprising happened. Peace, slow and subtle, began to seep into the corners of her life. Legal matters had to be dealt with, and they came quickly. Her father's will was read, revealing what she had suspected but never voiced. Despite the stepmother's attempts to claim otherwise, her father had left everything to his daughter. The house, the accounts, the personal items, all of it had been transferred to her name with quiet confidence. The documents were clear, direct, free of confusion or contradiction. It was as though he had known somehow that she would need that security, that proof in the aftermath of his death. The daughter sat in the lawyer's office holding the papers with steady hands, her heart a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He had protected her, even in his absence. In the weeks that followed, she began to rebuild not just the physical space around her, but her inner world, piece by piece. She cleaned the house room by room, not to erase the past but to reclaim it. She opened windows long kept shut, let sunlight flood spaces that had been darkened by grief and deception. She boxed up the remnants of her stepmother's presence, perfume bottles, clothing, decorative items that had never belonged. Some she donated, others she threw away without ceremony. Each action was small but deliberate, a quiet declaration that this was her home now, one where the air would no longer carry the weight of falsehoods. She reconnected with people who had once felt distant, friends from childhood, cousins who had hesitated at the funeral but later reached out with apologies and support. They told her how brave she had been, how proud her father would be. Some admitted they had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known what to say. She didn't hold their silence against them. She understood the power of appearances, how easily people could be misled by those who wore their lies like fine jewelry. What mattered now was that they saw her clearly, not as a girl defined by scandal, but as someone who had faced betrayal and stood firm. Slowly, her grief softened. It didn't fade, it never would, but it became less jagged. She no longer woke with that crushing weight in her chest, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Instead, she felt her father in quieter moments, in the scent of fresh coffee in the morning, in the rustle of leaves outside his old study window, in the way light fell across the kitchen counter just as it had when he used to make breakfast. She began journaling again, something she had stopped doing during his illness. Her words were tentative at first, hesitant to touch the depth of what she had endured. But over time, they grew steadier and writing became a way to process everything that had happened, to make meaning out of pain. She also returned to work, though she did it on her own terms. The office had been kind, offering her time and space, but she knew she couldn't stay in the same role forever. Too much had changed. So she began to explore new paths, courses, workshops, even volunteering with the local grief counseling center. She found comfort in listening to others and helping people find words for the sorrow they carried. It gave her perspective, reminding her that while her experience had been deeply personal, it was not unique. Loss, betrayal, and the need to reclaim one's life after devastation were threads that wove through countless stories. And in recognizing that, she began to feel less alone. Her relationship with herself also began to shift. For years, she had measured her worth through the lens of others, her father's love, her stepmother's approval, the expectations of the people around her. But now, standing on the other side of heartbreak, she started to redefine who she was on her own terms. She was no longer the girl who tried to be quiet to avoid conflict, who shrank herself to keep the peace. She was a woman who had faced a public humiliation and responded not with rage or vengeance, but with truth and grace. She had found strength not in dramatic confrontation, but in calm certainty. And that strength, once buried, now became her foundation. The seasons began to shift, and with them the house transformed. She painted the walls of the living room a soft, earthy green. The color her father had once said reminded him of spring. She planted a small garden in the backyard, just as he had planned to do before he got sick. Tomatoes, rosemary, sunflowers. She watered them each morning, watching them grow as if their roots were intertwined with her healing. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum of memories, but a living, breathing place where grief and growth could coexist. Letters began to arrive, some from people who had attended the funeral, others from those who had heard the story afterward. Strangers shared their own experiences of betrayal and silence, of learning truths too late. Each letter was a reminder that stories have power, and that by telling hers, she had given others permission to face their own. She kept the letters in a wooden box beside her bed, not as trophies, but as a testament to the reach of honesty, and the quiet ways in which healing could ripple outward. Months passed and life moved forward. There were still difficult days, unexpected moments when grief rose without warning. A song on the radio, the smell of his aftershave on a passing stranger, the sudden urge to call him when something good happened. But now those moments didn't break her. They reminded her of love, enduring, imperfect but real. She carried him with her, not as a wound, but as a presence, a quiet strength that lived in her every decision. She began to write more seriously, turning her journal entries into essays, reflections on grief, identity, and truth. One day, a friend suggested she share them. And eventually she did, first on a small blog, then in local newsletters, and finally in the pages of a book. She never intended to become a writer, but the story that had once nearly broken her became the story that helped her rebuild. People responded not because the story was sensational, but because it was real. And in that reality they found their own. She no longer feared her stepmother or the shadows of the past. That chapter had closed, not forgotten but placed firmly in the background. What mattered now was the life she was building, one rooted in truth, in resilience, and in the quiet certainty of knowing who she was. She had walked through fire and come out stronger. Not hardened but wiser. Not bitter but clear. And in that clarity she found peace. Not the kind that comes from erasing the past, but the kind that blooms when you own your story and begin again.